For decades, Eastern European countries seemed poised to battle a set of never-ending political and economic challenges. This group of countries, situated between the Western European countries and Russia, made them look like examples of an alternative path to the capitalist system that spread throughout Western countries, and one that, nonetheless, ended up provoking a raging economic collapse. Today, however, the Eastern European countries can boast of record economic growth in a moment in which many of their Western European counterparts suffer from struggling economies and rampant stagnation. Tables have turned in the old continent, but how did some of the most troubled European economies achieve such an impressive metamorphosis? This is how Eastern Europe transformed into the economic powerhouse that it is today. But before we move forward, we'd appreciate your support. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel for new geopolitical content uploaded weekly. For much of the 20th century, the economic transformation of the Eastern European nations was not a given. It was the beginning of the century, and the Russian Revolution, once the Tsarism was overthrown, gave way to the rise of the Soviet Union. It was the time of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, a context in which the Soviet Union came to be in 1922, after a bloody civil war and under the leadership of the Marxist thinker. By then, transformation in much of Eastern Europe was underway, further deepening when Joseph Stalin rose to power. After Lenin's death in 1924, the Georgian transformed the USSR into a centralized, totalitarian state. After World War II, the USSR expanded its influence over Eastern Europe. It did so to create a buffer against the West by establishing pro-communist governments in countries like Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and East Germany, and in doing so, consolidating their control over a vast geographic area. This expansion, and the transformation of the newly changed Eastern European countries into a cohesive bloc, contributed to the onset of the Cold War. From the other side of the Iron Curtain, the United States and its Western allies sought to contain the Soviet influence by coming up with measures like the Marshall Plan and the foundation of NATO. As such, by the late 1940s, Europe was clearly divided into East and West. In order to understand the region's vast economic development, it is necessary to understand the economic direction that this group of countries adopted under their newly established Soviet leadership. The USSR influence imposed a sweeping set of economic changes on these nations, changes that aimed at shifting them from market economies to centrally planned systems. The first step taken by the Soviet Union was to impose the obligation of Germany, providing reparations given the destruction caused by World War II. The USSR also imposed heavy economic and military burdens on Eastern European countries, including the extraction of resources and forced industrialization. Simultaneously, the communist governments of countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic nationalized industries, collectivized agriculture, and implemented central planning based on the Soviet mandates. At first, the changes had a positive effect. During the 50s and 60s, these countries underwent a heavy industrialization phase, guided by socialist economic principles. It unleashed a short period of growth, at least before the inefficiencies in central planning set in, and the inefficacies, such as a misallocation of resources and lack of innovation, became clear. This led to a drop in standards of living. The next 2 decades were marked by rampant economic stagnation across most of Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland and the east part of Germany, with developed industrial sectors, struggled with low productivity, lack of technological innovation, and a growing dependence on Soviet energy supplies. Soon, state-run economies also suffered from mounting debt, inflation, and shortages. The fall of the Soviet Union, symbolized by the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, triggered a rampant economic crisis throughout the ex-Soviet bloc. During the first half of the 1990s, these economies fell sharply. According to the World Bank data, 1991 was a year of economic catastrophe for this group of nations. Romania's economy fell over 12%, Slovakia's over 14%, Croatia's over 21%, and Albania's, the most battered of them all, an eye-popping 28%. After the fall of the Soviet Union, in order to recover economically, these nations had to try to quickly integrate themselves into the New World Order and transition to market-based economies. Although some of the Eastern European countries had already started their economic transformation before the disappearance of the Soviet Entente, it was the definite fall of the USSR that boosted their economic transformation. The transition to market economies comprised two different phases. In the first one, most countries liberalised their trade, privatised many of the state companies, and saw governments adopting a more hands-off approach to the economy. The second started right after and sought to build the type of public and private institutions that fostered a market economy while strengthening the state's capacity to raise revenues and ensure that sound business practices were adopted and established. This is known as a state's regulatory capacity. The economic transformation of the Eastern European countries was, however, just the first step. There is another factor that played a crucial role in turning the former communist nations into the impressive market economies that we see today. The second development that fostered the impressive economic growth of Eastern Europe came at the turn of the century in the form of the European Union's enlargement. It started in 2004 with the Union's fifth enlargement, which saw Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia becoming members of the EU. These countries' accession to the EU pursued two distinct goals. On one hand, it tried to create the conditions for an everlasting peace in the European continent. On the other hand, it aimed at solidifying the economic changes these countries had experienced in the previous decades. As such, their entry into the EU ended up further boosting their economic performances. It also gave them access to the single market, a vast trade zone that became the preferred destination for its exports. Furthermore, these two forces had an additional positive effect for the Eastern nations. It made them considerably attractive in the eyes of foreign investors. According to the International Monetary Fund, by 2016, the Eastern European countries that were members of the EU had attracted over $700 billion in foreign direct investments. Foreign investors were attracted here mainly by two factors. First, the lower labour costs of these countries in comparison with their Western neighbours, and second, in many cases, by the ability to gain access to these emerging markets, some of which are quite large in and of themselves, such as Poland. The economic boom of Eastern Europe has been remarkable. According to the World Bank, between 1990, just after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and 2018, most of these countries experienced record growth rates. Poland saw its economy grow 788%, Slovakia 739%, and Estonia 592%. Croatia, the country with the most modest growth and one of the smallest, saw its economy increase a whopping 172% in 3 decades. But the economic growth of the former communist nations is only part of the story. Its citizens have also benefited from a consistent rise in living standards and quality of life. Citizens here are expected to live an average of 10 more years than they were in the 90s. Even today, amid grim prospects of economic stagnation for much of its Western neighbours, the countries of the east of Europe maintain their economic push. In 2024, this group of countries are expected to close the year with an average 2.6% growth, a remarkable number that offers a stark contrast with the meagre 0.6% that is expected for the broader Euro area. For 2025, the forecast is even brighter for the Eastern European nations, expected to sport an average growth of 3%, which will continue to outpace the Eurozone's 1.6% projected growth. The current outstanding economic performance of the Eastern European nations has a lot to do with an idea that has been a cornerstone of the EU's integration for a long time, and that is the concept of economic convergence. Under this idea, the expectation was that all members of the European Union, given enough time operating as members of the single market, would end up converging economically. That is to say that all countries would reach a similar level of economic development, thanks to the participation in the common European economy. In this context, what has been happening in the Eastern European nations in the last few decades is not very different from what occurred in countries such as Spain or Portugal when they became integrated into the global economy and later on joined the EU. The main difference has been the timing. While the onset of Spain and Portugal's economic modernisation took place in the 80s, most of the Eastern European countries did not start the same process until the second half of the 90s. Some experts predict that at least some of these Eastern nations may overtake their Western neighbours in terms of economic development in the upcoming decades. The reasons are varied. Firstly, the region's labour costs remain lower than those in Western Europe. This makes them still very attractive for foreign investors, especially in manufacturing, technological industries, and some services. Secondly, some of these nations such as Poland and Slovakia possess a young, well-educated labour force that can prove useful for future innovation and entrepreneurship. Additionally, increased digitalisation and adoption of new technologies could further narrow the gap. The EU's Green Deal, which promotes sustainable economic practices, also offers opportunities for Eastern Europe to lead in sectors like renewable energy and green technologies. This Eastern overtaking may happen particularly rapidly in Southern European nations. According to the IMF, Slovenia's per capita income might be higher than that of Italy's by as soon as 2029. The Czech Republic has already surpassed the per capita GDP of both Portugal and Greece, and it is closing in on Spain and Italy. By the end of the decade, according to Bloomberg, the Czech Republic, Poland, Slovenia, and Lithuania will have higher living standards than Spain. By then, once the Eastern European countries start consolidating higher economic development than many of their European counterparts to the West, their transformation will be complete. And that might very well be one of the most impressive economic feats the world has seen in the last 2 centuries.